October 15th, 1991. Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. Colonel Viktor Antonovich Petrov's hand trembled slightly as he signed the access log that would grant him entry to one of America's most sensitive military installations. The pen felt heavy, loaded with the weight of 4 decades of Cold War mythology about to be shattered. They cannot have this many, he thought, staring at the roster of B-52 stealth bombers visible through the hangar windows. Our intelligence must be wrong. 3 weeks earlier, the Soviet Union had officially dissolved. Now, as part of the newly formed Commonwealth of Independent States, Russian military officers were participating in something previously unthinkable: reciprocal nuclear inspections mandated by the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START-I. What these inspectors would discover over the next 18 months would fundamentally transform their understanding of the Cold War they had just lost. The psychological impact would prove more devastating than any military defeat. A systematic demolition of Soviet strategic assumptions through direct observation of American nuclear capabilities that existed on a scale their worst nightmares had underestimated. The journey begins. The transformation started on September 12, 1991, at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland. A delegation of 42 Soviet, soon-to-be Russian, military officers arrived aboard an Aeroflot Tu-154, their first official visit to American nuclear installations under the newly ratified START Treaty. Among them was Major General Alexander Mihailovich Lebed, a decorated Afghan war veteran who would later write the most detailed account of these inspections. We stepped off the aircraft expecting hostility, suspicion, the treatment we would have given American inspectors at our facilities. Lebed wrote in his 1995 memoir. Instead, we were greeted by an Air Force general who welcomed us in passable Russian, offered us coffee, and handed each of us a briefing packet that contained more information about American strategic forces than the GRU had collected in 40 years of espionage. The briefing packet itself was the first shock. Glossy, professionally printed, containing detailed specifications, production numbers, deployment locations, and operational capabilities of America's strategic nuclear triad. Information that would have cost Soviet intelligence officers their lives to obtain was being handed out freely. Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Nikolaevich Balyuevsky, who would later become chief of the Russian General Staff, recalled. The packet listed 1,054 Minuteman missiles in active service. We had estimated 800, perhaps 900 at most. They were telling us we had underestimated by 20%. This was before we had even left the airfield. The bus ride from Andrews to the first inspection site, the Pantex nuclear weapons assembly plant in Amarillo, Texas, provided the second wave of cognitive dissonance. The delegation traveled through American cities at night, witnessing the same phenomenon that had stunned German POWs 50 years earlier: the sheer abundance of electrical power. Washington glowed like a star, wrote Colonel Petrov. Not just government buildings, but every office tower, every apartment block, every street corner blazed with light. We had been told America was suffering economic decline, that their military spending had bankrupted them. Yet they illuminated their capital like it was midday at midnight. Through Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Arkansas, and into Texas, the pattern repeated. Every town, every city, every highway rest stop displayed casual abundance. The inspectors saw parking lots full of civilian cars. American officers casually mentioned that most military families owned 2 or 3 vehicles. They passed shopping centers operating at 10 p.m., their parking lots crowded. They stopped at a truck stop in Oklahoma, where the restaurant menu offered 40 different items, all available at any hour. Colonel Gennady Pavlovich Zhukov, a Strategic Rocket Forces officer, kept a detailed diary that was declassified in 2015. At the truck stop, an American captain bought dinner for our entire delegation. The meal, steak, potatoes, vegetables, pie, cost him $380 total. He paid with a credit card casually, like it was nothing. He told us his monthly salary was $3,400. I was earning 420 rubles monthly, worth perhaps $30 on the black market. This junior officer earned more in a week than I earned in a year. Pantex, the first revelation. November 1st, 1991. The Soviet inspection team arrived at the Pantex plant, the sole facility responsible for assembling and disassembling America's nuclear weapons. What they found there would haunt their understanding of the Cold War for decades. The plant sprawled across 16,000 acres of Texas Panhandle, employing over 3,600 workers. The Soviets had known of its existence. Satellite photographs had tracked its expansion since the 1950s. What they hadn't understood was the scale of operations. They gave us a tour of the assembly facilities, wrote Major General Labed. Not a cursory inspection, but a comprehensive tour. They showed us the production lines, where they had assembled 30,000 nuclear weapons over 40 years. 30,000. We had estimated American stockpile at perhaps 12,000 weapons at peak. They had built and deployed more than twice what our best intelligence suggested. The technical sophistication was equally shocking. Colonel Mikhail Sergeyevich Popov, a nuclear weapons designer from Artemis-16, examined the W-88 warhead assembly process with growing horror. The precision was extraordinary. He later testified to the Russian Duma. Automated manufacturing processes we had only theorized about. Quality control systems that tested every component multiple times. Clean rooms that exceeded anything we had at Chelyabinsk-70. They were building weapons with reliability rates we couldn't achieve even with hand assembly. But the most devastating revelation came in the storage bunkers. Row upon row of weapons in various stages of assembly or disassembly, organized with computerized inventory systems that tracked every component. They pulled up records on a computer terminal, wrote Colonel Petrov. Complete history of every weapon. When it was built, where it was deployed, its maintenance schedule, test results. They had digitized records going back to 1958. We were still using paper ledgers at our facilities, and half of those were incomplete or lost. The safety systems astounded the Soviet inspectors. Multiple redundant security measures, environmental controls, automated fire suppression, seismic isolation for storage bunkers. The Americans had spent more on safety systems at this one facility than the Soviet Union had spent on all its nuclear infrastructure combined. They told us there had never been a serious accident at Pantex. Labed wrote, no contamination, no weapon detonations, no significant radiation exposure in 40 years of operations. We thought they were lying. Then they showed us the safety records, the independent audits, the environmental monitoring data. It was true. They had achieved what we considered impossible, safe nuclear weapons production. Minot Air Force Base, the Triad's first leg. December 3, 1991. Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. Temperature, -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The Soviet inspection team arrived to examine America's ICBM forces, the land-based component of the nuclear triad. The base hosted the 91st Missile Wing, controlling 150 Minuteman III missiles spread across 8,500 square miles of North Dakota prairie. Each missile carried up to 3 independently targetable warheads, each 335 kilotons, 20 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. We knew about Minuteman, wrote Colonel Balyuevsky. We had designed our SS-18 Satan missiles specifically to counter them. What we didn't know was how many really existed, or how sophisticated they were. The first inspection took them to a launch control center, one of 15 that managed the wing's missiles. The facility, buried beneath 8,000 pounds of reinforced concrete and steel, could survive anything short of a direct nuclear hit. The Americans showed us everything, wrote Captain Igor Vladimirovich Kolesnikov, a junior officer on the inspection team. The launch control consoles, the communication systems, the authentication procedures. They walked us through the entire launch sequence, explaining how 2 officers had to simultaneously turn keys, separated by 12 feet, to prevent any single person from launching missiles. The redundancy and reliability of the systems shocked the Soviets. Multiple independent communication channels, backup power systems, hardened electronics designed to survive electromagnetic pulse. The Americans had thought of everything. Our SS-18 silos were primitive by comparison, admitted Colonel Petrov. We had reliability problems, communication failures, guidance system malfunctions. The Americans had engineered solutions to every problem we still struggled with. The missile silos themselves scattered across the frozen prairie, represented engineering achievement the Soviets hadn't matched. Each Minuteman III sat in a hardened silo that could withstand blast overpressure that would destroy any Soviet silo. The missiles could be launched within 60 seconds of receiving orders, while Soviet SS-18s required 4 minutes. But the most shocking discovery came when inspectors examined the missile maintenance records. Every missile had complete maintenance history, wrote Major Yevgeny Pavlovich Maslin, who would later head Russia's nuclear weapons program. They test-fired missiles regularly to verify systems. The accuracy data was extraordinary, circular error probable of 120 meters at intercontinental range. Our SS-18s had CEP of 500 meters. They could hit a specific building. We could only hit a city. The tour included the missile assembly and maintenance facility, where teams could remove a missile, inspect or replace components, and return it to service, all within a scheduled maintenance window. The Soviets watched as technicians demonstrated removing a reentry vehicle from a Minuteman, a process that took American crews 6 hours with specialized equipment. The equivalent process on an SS-18 required 3 days and often resulted in component damage. The Americans maintained their missiles like precision instruments. Lebed wrote, "We maintained ours like farm equipment. Both approach worked, but theirs worked better." Whiteman and the Invisible Bomber. January 15, 1992. Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. The inspection team arrived to examine the aircraft component of America's nuclear triad, including the aircraft that haunted Soviet air defense planners' nightmares, the B-52 Spirit stealth bomber. The existence of the B-52 was no secret. First flight had occurred in 1989. What was secret was its capabilities, its radar cross-section, its actual numbers. Soviet intelligence had estimated 6 to 8 operational aircraft. They believed American claims of 21 B-2s were propaganda designed to justify the program's massive cost. "They took us directly to the hangar," Colonel Petrov wrote. "Opened the doors, and there they were. 5 B-2s in various states of maintenance. Matte black, angular, alien. The most expensive aircraft in history, sitting in front of us like prize automobiles." The Americans allowed the inspectors to walk around the aircraft, though not touch or photograph certain areas. The size shocked them, wingspan of 172 feet, larger than any bomber the Soviets had built. The flying wing design, the blended surfaces, the absence of vertical stabilizers, every aspect optimized for stealth. An American colonel, a pilot with 800 hours in the B-2, briefed us on capabilities, wrote Colonel Zhukov. Combat radius of 6,000 miles without refueling. Payload of 40,000 pounds of nuclear weapons. Radar cross-section equivalent to a large bird. Can penetrate Soviet air defense without being detected. The Soviet officers, many of them air defense specialists, knew their systems intimately. They had designed the SA-10 and SA-12 surface-to-air missiles specifically to counter American bombers. Yet the B-2's radar cross-section made detection nearly impossible until the bomber was already over its target. He showed us penetration studies, Lebed recalled. Computer simulations of B-2 strikes against Soviet air defense networks. In scenario after scenario, the bomber penetrated undetected. Our entire air defense system, hundreds of billions of rubles, thousands of missiles, decades of development, rendered obsolete by American technology. But the real shock came when they toured the maintenance facilities and saw the manufacturing precision required. Radar-absorbing materials applied with micron-level precision. Surface irregularities measured and corrected. Quality control that rejected components for flaws invisible to the human eye. Each B-2 cost $2.2 billion, wrote Colonel Petrov. More than our entire annual defense budget. They built 21 of them. The Americans spent $44 billion on a single bomber program, more than the Soviet Union spent on all military aviation in the 1980s combined. The inspection included the B-52 fleet, the ancient but upgraded bomber that had served since the 1950s. 76 B-52HS remained in service, each modified extensively with modern avionics, precision navigation, and capable of carrying nuclear cruise missiles. The B-52s were older than their pilots, noted Captain Kolesnikov. Some had been in service for 40 years. Yet they had been maintained and upgraded continuously. New engines, new electronics, new weapon systems. They were old airframes with modern capabilities. We learned that Americans planned to keep flying B-52s until 2050, a century of service. This maintainability, the American ability to keep systems operational for decades through continuous upgrades, represented a fundamental advantage Soviet systems lacked. Soviet aircraft deteriorated rapidly, requiring constant replacement. American aircraft were designed for longevity and systematic modernization. Kings Bay, the Silent Service. February 20th, 1992. Naval Submarine Base, Kings Bay, Georgia. The inspection team arrived to examine the third and most terrifying leg of America's nuclear triad, ballistic missile submarines. Soviet intelligence knew America operated Ohio-class submarines armed with Trident missiles. They tracked these submarines constantly, unsuccessfully. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was how quiet they were, how capable, how utterly invulnerable to Soviet anti-submarine warfare. We toured USS Pennsylvania, wrote Captain First Rank Alexander Igorevich Vitko, a submarine officer who would later command Russia's Northern Fleet, an Ohio-class SSBN, carrying 24 Trident II-D5 missiles, each missile with 8 W-88 warheads, each warhead 475 kilotons. This single submarine carried more destructive power than all bombs dropped in World War II combined. The Americans allowed extensive, though supervised, access to the submarine. The Soviets saw the missile compartment with its 24 launch tubes, each 34 feet tall. They examined the navigation systems, the communications equipment, the propulsion plant. Everything represented technology a generation ahead of Soviet capabilities. The reactor was extraordinary, wrote Captain Vitko. S-8G reactor, 220 megawatts thermal, powering electric drive. Nearly silent operation. Classified acoustic signature. But Americans said it was quieter than ambient ocean noise at tactical speeds. We believed them. Our attack submarines could never find American SSBNs during exercises. The submarine's endurance shocked the Soviet officers. 90-day patrols without surfacing. Food for 160 crew members for 3 months. Navigation systems that could determine position within meters, without GPS or surface references. Communication systems that could receive launch orders through hundreds of feet of water. The crew quarters were better than our surface ships, noted Captain Kolesnikov. Each sailor had their own bunk, no hot bunking like on Soviet submarines. The food was remarkable. The Americans showed us the galley, the frozen and refrigerated storage. They ate better underwater than we ate in port. But the most sobering revelation came during the briefing on Trident II-D5 missiles. Colonel Maslin, the nuclear weapons specialist, asked detailed technical questions and received detailed technical answers. The D5 achieved accuracy we considered impossible from a submarine-launched missile, he wrote. CEP of 90 meters at 7,000-mile range. This was better than our land-based ICBMs. The Americans could hit a specific building with a missile launched from a moving submarine thousands of miles away. The tour included the refit facilities, where submarines underwent maintenance. The Americans showed them how Ohio-class boats were cut in half and had new missile sections inserted during service life extension programs. The precision of the work, the scale of the facilities, the cost, routinely spending $200 million to upgrade a single submarine, demonstrated commitment to maintaining capabilities regardless of expense. We toured the submarine base, wrote Lebed. 14 Ohio-class SSBNs homeport at Kings Bay and Bangor, each one capable of destroying an entire nation. The Americans told us that at least 8 were at sea at any moment, locations unknown even to their own Navy, an invulnerable retaliatory force that guaranteed mutual destruction. The Soviet officers understood the strategic implications immediately. Even if the Soviet Union launched a perfect first strike, destroying every American ICBM silo, every bomber base, every command center, the submarines at sea would survive. And any 2 of them carried enough firepower to annihilate Soviet civilization. We had built nuclear weapons to win wars, reflected Colonel Petrov years later. The Americans built them to make war impossible. The distinction seemed subtle but proved fundamental. Los Alamos, the forge of the gods. March 30th, 1992. Los Alamos National Laboratory, New Mexico. The birthplace of nuclear weapons opened its gates to Soviet inspection for the first time in history. The laboratory sprawled across 43 square miles of mesa and canyon, employing 13,000 people and operating with an annual budget of $2.1 billion, more than the entire Soviet nuclear weapons program received in a year. They gave us badges and security clearances, wrote Colonel Popov, the weapons designer. Then they gave us a tour that lasted 3 days. They showed us things I didn't believe existed. The tour included the DRHT facility, dual-axis radiographic hydrodynamic test, a machine capable of taking X-ray photographs of nuclear weapon cores during implosion tests. The Soviets had nothing comparable. They could test weapon designs without nuclear detonations, Popov explained. Perfect the implosion dynamics, verify plutonium compression, optimize yield-to-weight ratios, all without atmospheric tests. We were still testing actual weapons in Kazakhstan, while they were perfecting designs in laboratory. The computing facilities astounded the Soviet physicists. Thousands of workstations, supercomputers performing billions of calculations per second, three-dimensional modeling of nuclear detonations down to microsecond timescales. They showed us computer simulations of thermonuclear burn, wrote Dr. Yuri Alexeyevich Trutnev, one of the Soviet Union's leading weapons designers. They could model the first microseconds of a nuclear explosion with accuracy that matched physical test data. They knew more about how nuclear weapons worked than we did, and they had figured it out with computers. The materials science facilities revealed another dimension of American advantage. Clean rooms where plutonium components were manufactured with submicron precision. Metallurgical laboratories studying weapon aging and degradation. Research into new materials, new geometries, new concepts. At Arzimas 16, we had one electron microscope, Dr. Trutnev noted. At Los Alamos, I counted 15. They had equipment we didn't know existed. They studied single atoms, while we were still working with bulk materials. But the most profound shock came from the openness. After initial security briefings, the American scientists discussed their work freely, answered questions, explained concepts. The Soviet weapons designers had operated under paranoid secrecy their entire careers, forbidden to discuss their work even with colleagues in adjacent programs. The Americans published research papers, attended international conferences, collaborated openly. A young American physicist, she couldn't have been 30 years old, explained advanced concepts in weapon design, Dr. Trutnev recalled. She had a PhD from MIT, worked at Los Alamos for 5 years. In the Soviet Union, someone with her knowledge would have been imprisoned in a secret city for life. Here, she lived in Santa Fe, drove to work, had a normal life. The Americans had achieved security through capability, not secrecy. The tour included the Weapons Museum, where decades of American nuclear designs were displayed openly. The inspectors saw the evolution from crude Fat Man and Little Boy designs to sophisticated modern weapons, each generation smaller, lighter, more efficient, more reliable. The W-88 warhead, wrote Colonel Popov, 475 kilotons, weighs 360 kilograms, fits in a cone 55 inches long and 22 inches wide. Our most advanced design, the SS-18 warhead, yielded 750 kilotons, but weighed 1,800 kilograms and required 3 times the volume. They achieved better yield-to-weight ratios through superior design and materials. The Nevada Test Site, Monuments to Abandoned Power, April 15, 1992. The Nevada Test Site, 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. Here, the United States had detonated 928 nuclear weapons between 1951 and 1992, more than all other nations combined. The inspection team toured ground zero of various tests, saw the massive subsidence craters left by underground explosions, examined the instrumentation bunkers built to survive nearby detonations. The scale of the testing program demonstrated commitment to nuclear development that dwarfed Soviet efforts. They had tested everything, wrote Dr. Trutnev. Every design concept, every material, every yield optimization. The Americans had acquired more empirical data about nuclear weapons than all other nuclear powers combined. This knowledge base gave them capabilities we couldn't match. But the most striking impression came from what they didn't see. The test site had been inactive since September 1992, when the United States began observing a unilateral nuclear testing moratorium. The Soviets, now Russians, continued testing at Semipalatinsk until the Soviet collapse. The Americans stopped testing because they had learned everything they needed to know. Lebed observed, "We kept testing because we were still figuring out basics." They had moved beyond physical tests to computer simulations. We were still trying to catch up to where they had been in 1970. The inspection of the Nevada test site marked a turning point in the Soviet officers' understanding. They weren't just seeing superior technology or greater numbers. They were witnessing a fundamental difference in how the two superpowers approached nuclear weapons. The Americans had industrialized nuclear weapons development, systematized it, and ultimately perfected it to the point where further physical testing became unnecessary. Strategic Command, the mind of the beast. May 1, 1992. United States Strategic Command Headquarters, Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. The inspection team entered the facility that controlled America's entire nuclear arsenal. Deep beneath the Nebraska prairie, in command centers designed to survive nuclear war, American officers monitored every nuclear weapon in the American arsenal. Real-time displays showed the status of every ICBM, every bomber, every submarine. Communication systems maintained constant contact with forces worldwide. "They showed us the looking glass," wrote Colonel Balyevsky, referring to the Airborne Command Post. EC-135 aircraft that had maintained continuous flight for 30 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. One was always airborne with a general officer aboard, ready to assume command if ground-based headquarters were destroyed. The redundancy and reliability of American command and control overwhelmed the Soviet officers. Multiple independent communication channels, satellite links, hardened ground lines, airborne relays. The Americans had spent billions ensuring they could always communicate with their forces, always launch a retaliatory strike. They explained the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. Lebed wrote, "A computer-optimized nuclear war plan that assigned specific targets to specific weapons, coordinated timing to minimize fratricide, maximize damage to Soviet forces while minimizing collateral casualties where possible." They had mapped every military target in the Soviet Union, assigned weapons, and continuously updated the plan based on intelligence. The sophistication stunned the Soviet officers. While Soviet nuclear planning remained relatively crude, launch everything at American cities, the Americans had developed surgical strike plans that could decapitate Soviet leadership while attempting to spare civilian populations. "They showed us Milstar," wrote Captain Kolesnikov, referring to the military strategic and tactical relay satellite system, constellation of communication satellites that could survive nuclear electromagnetic pulse, continue operating after nuclear war. The Americans had ensured they could fight through nuclear exchange and maintain command of their forces. We had no equivalent system. The hidden arsenal, tactical nuclear weapons, the strategic nuclear forces, ICBMs, bombers, and submarines, were only part of America's nuclear capability. The inspection teams also discovered the vast arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons deployed worldwide. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the teams saw B-51 nuclear bombs stored in underground vaults. These variable-yield weapons could be set from 0.3 to 340 kilotons, allowing tactical employment without destroying entire cities. The Americans had 1,350 tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe alone, wrote Colonel Zhukov. Modern weapons with enhanced radiation options, earth-penetrating capabilities, minimal fallout designs. They had thought through every possible use case for nuclear weapons. Naval installations revealed nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missiles, nuclear depth charges, nuclear artillery shells. The Americans had nuclearized everything. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, they showed us W-48 155mm nuclear artillery shells. Lebed recalled, "Nuclear weapons that could be fired from standard artillery pieces. Yield of just 72 tons. Designed for battlefield use against mass tank formations." The Americans had created tactical nuclear weapons with yields smaller than conventional bombs. This diversity of nuclear options reflected American strategic thinking fundamentally different from Soviet doctrine. Where the Soviets saw nuclear weapons as city destroyers, the Americans had developed options for limited nuclear war, tactical employment, precise targeting, the cost of the arsenal. Throughout the inspections, one question haunted the Soviet officers. How much did all this cost? The Americans answered freely. Between 1945 and 1991, the United States had spent approximately $5.5 trillion on nuclear weapons and related programs. This included $410 billion on strategic forces, $115 billion on tactical nuclear weapons, $843 billion on nuclear weapons production facilities, $203 billion on command, control, and communications, $394 billion on defense against nuclear weapons, $3.5 trillion on strategic defenses and related programs, $5.5 trillion. Colonel Petrov wrote in his diary, more than the entire gross domestic product of the Soviet Union over the same period. The Americans had spent more on nuclear weapons than our entire economy produced in 46 years. But the spending wasn't the most shocking revelation. It was the efficiency. Despite spending astronomical sums, the United States had maintained the world's largest economy, raised living standards continuously, and preserved democratic freedoms. The Soviet Union had bankrupted itself, trying to keep pace with a fraction of America's nuclear spending. We sacrificed everything for nuclear parity. Lebed reflected. Food, housing, consumer goods, personal freedom, all subordinated to matching American nuclear forces. And we failed. We built 45,000 nuclear weapons. We deployed the world's largest ICBM force. We achieved rough numerical parity. But we bankrupted our nation doing it while the Americans built an even larger arsenal almost as an afterthought. The human dimension. Amid the overwhelming statistics and technical revelations, what struck the Soviet inspectors most profoundly was the human element. The American officers and scientists they met weren't the monsters depicted in Soviet propaganda. They were professionals, often friendly, sometimes surprisingly candid. At Minot Air Force Base, young missile officers, many no older than 25, discussed the psychological burden of nuclear responsibility with remarkable openness. A lieutenant told me he sometimes had nightmares about turning the key. Captain Kolesnikov recorded. He knew those missiles would kill millions. He knew his job was to destroy the world if ordered. Yet he served because he believed deterrence prevented war. This moral wrestling with nuclear duty, the Americans encouraged it, discussed it, provided counseling. We had been trained to follow orders without question. The scientists at Los Alamos spoke openly about the ethical implications of their work. Many had participated in anti-nuclear protests, even while designing weapons. A physicist explained that he designed weapons to make them so terrible that no one would use them. Dr. Trutnev recalled. This paradox, building weapons to prevent war, the Americans had internalized it. They understood that nuclear weapons had transformed warfare into suicide. At Strategic Command, a general explained American nuclear doctrine with uncomfortable honesty. He told us that nuclear war was unwinnable. Lebed wrote that no plan existed for emerging victorious from nuclear exchange. The Americans had built this massive arsenal for one purpose, to ensure it would never be used. They called it mutual assured destruction, and they meant it literally. This fundamental difference in philosophy shocked the Soviet officers. Soviet doctrine held that nuclear war could be won, that with proper civil defense and sufficient weapons, the Soviet Union could emerge victorious. The Americans had abandoned such thinking decades earlier. The collapse of Soviet assumptions. By June 1992, after 8 months of inspections, the Soviet officers had witnessed enough to shatter every assumption they had held about the balance of power. Colonel Petrov compiled a confidential report to the Russian General Staff that would later be partially declassified. American nuclear capabilities exceed Soviet intelligence estimates by approximately 40% in deployed warheads, 60% in accuracy, 300% in command and control reliability, and incalculable superiority in technological sophistication. More significantly, American nuclear infrastructure, the industrial base, research facilities, production capacity, exceeds Soviet capabilities by an order of magnitude. The United States can design, test, manufacture, and deploy nuclear weapons with speed and precision we cannot match. Most critically, Americans have achieved these capabilities while maintaining the world's strongest economy and highest living standards. They have not sacrificed civilian prosperity for military power. They have achieved both simultaneously. The Cold War was not a close-run competition between equals. It was an illusion maintained by Soviet secrecy and American restraint. At any point, the United States could have expanded its nuclear forces beyond any possibility of Soviet response. They chose not to, not from weakness, but from judgment that existing forces ensure deterrence. We did not achieve nuclear parity with the United States. We achieved the appearance of parity through inferior weapons deployed in large numbers. Quality versus quantity, and quality won. This report, circulated among Russian military leadership, contributed to fundamental reassessment of Soviet military history. Officers who had devoted careers to matching American power realized they had been chasing an impossible goal. The lessons learned. Major General Lebed, in his 1995 memoir, synthesized the psychological impact of the inspections. We entered American nuclear facilities as representatives of a rival superpower. We left as students who had glimpsed how far behind we truly were. The Americans hadn't just built more weapons or better weapons. They had created an entire system, industrial, scientific, administrative, optimized for nuclear weapons development. They had institutionalized excellence. Every Soviet achievement in nuclear weapons had been accomplished through heroic individual effort, often despite our system. Every American achievement was the natural output of their system working normally. We had brilliant scientists working in secret cities with inadequate equipment. They had brilliant scientists working in well-equipped laboratories with access to global scientific knowledge. We had dedicated military officers maintaining weapons with limited resources. They had dedicated military officers maintaining weapons with unlimited resources. We had engineers improvising solutions to problems. They had engineers implementing best practices developed through decades of experience. The gap wasn't just in numbers or technology. It was in systematic capability, the American capacity to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement them at scale. The legacy of revelation. The START inspections continued through 1993 and beyond, with Russian teams making regular visits to American nuclear facilities and American teams visiting Russian sites. The transparency regime established by START would eventually lead to dramatic reductions in both nations' arsenals. But the psychological impact of those initial inspections shaped Russian strategic thinking for decades. Officers who had witnessed American nuclear capabilities firsthand became advocates for fundamental military reform. Colonel Balyuevsky, who became chief of the General Staff in 2004, implemented changes informed by his experiences during the 1991 to 1992 inspections. He streamlined command structures, emphasized technological modernization, and advocated for quality over quantity in military planning. Dr. Trutnev, the weapons designer, used his experiences to reform Russia's nuclear weapons complex. He pushed for better equipment, improved working conditions, and greater openness within the scientific community. We cannot match American resources, he told the Russian government. But we can learn from American methods. Open scientific exchange, systematic quality control, honest assessment of capabilities. These cost nothing but pride. Several former inspectors rose to senior positions in the Russian government and military, bringing with them transformed understanding of American power. General Lebed served as Secretary of the Security Council and nearly became Russian president. Colonel Balyuevsky became Chief of the General Staff. Dr. Trutnev continued weapons research while advocating arms control. Colonel Petrov became Deputy Minister of Defense. Captain Vitko commanded the Black Sea Fleet. Their collective influence helped shift Russian strategic thinking away from futile attempts at quantitative parity toward qualitative improvements and diplomatic engagement. The arsenal of democracy, Redux. The German POWs of World War II had witnessed American industrial might producing tanks, planes, and ships in unimaginable quantities. The Soviet inspectors of the 1990s witnessed the same industrial genius applied to nuclear weapons, with results even more profound. Where the Germans had seen factories producing B-24s every hour, the Soviets saw laboratories designing warheads with yields optimized to the kiloton. Where the Germans had seen agricultural abundance, the Soviets saw technical excellence that made Soviet accomplishments seem primitive. The psychological mechanism was identical, the complete demolition of ideology through direct observation of overwhelming capability. The Germans had believed in racial superiority and witnessed multiracial cooperation producing unprecedented industrial output. The Soviets had believed in socialist superiority and witnessed capitalist democracy producing technological marvels. In both cases, the transformation came not through propaganda, but through reality. The Americans didn't have to convince their visitors of anything. They simply had to show them what existed. The numbers tell the story. By the end of start-eye inspections, the inventory of American nuclear capabilities had been fully documented. Strategic Forces, 1992. ICBMs, 1,550 Minuteman III, 450 Peacekeeper. SLBMs, 568 missiles on 18 Ohio-class submarines. Bombers, 191, 96B, 52H, 95B-1B. Total deployed strategic warheads, 10,563. Tactical nuclear weapons. Theater nuclear weapons, 1,350. Naval nuclear weapons, 1,750. Nuclear artillery shells, 1,000. Nuclear land mines, 850. Supporting infrastructure. Production facilities, 13 major plants. Research laboratories, 9 national laboratories. Testing facilities, 2 active sites, Nevada, Pacific. Command centers, 5 hardened facilities plus airborne command posts. Total investment, 1945 to 1991. $5.5 trillion in constant 2020 dollars. 67,500 nuclear weapons produced. 13,100 facilities involved in production and deployment. 228 underground nuclear tests conducted. The Soviet Union, by comparison. Strategic Forces, 1992. ICBMs, 1,400 various types, many aging. SLBMs, 940 missiles on 62 submarines, many non-operational. Bombers, 160, 79-2, 95, 81-2, 160/2, 22M. Total deployed strategic warheads, 10,271. Tactical nuclear weapons. Theater nuclear weapons, 4,500. Naval nuclear weapons, 2,850. Nuclear artillery shells, 1,800. Nuclear land mines, 700. Supporting infrastructure. Production facilities, 10 major plants, aging, poorly maintained. Research laboratories, 2 primary centers, closed cities. Testing facilities, 1 active site, Semipalatinsk. Command centers, 3 hardened facilities, unreliable communications. Total investment, 1945 to 1991. Estimated $4.5 trillion in constant 2020 dollars. 55,000 nuclear weapons produced. 8,900 facilities involved. 715 nuclear tests conducted. The numbers revealed a sobering truth. The Soviet Union had spent nearly as much as the United States on nuclear weapons, but as a percentage of GDP, the cost was catastrophic. While America devoted roughly 4 to 6% of its economy to nuclear forces, the Soviet Union had spent 15 to 20%. The Americans had built their arsenal from abundance. The Soviets had built theirs from scarcity. The reliability gap. Beyond raw numbers, the inspections revealed a reliability gap that was perhaps more significant than any other disparity. American systems simply worked better. Colonel Maslin, the nuclear weapons specialist, compiled comparative reliability statistics from the inspections. ICBM reliability. American Minuteman III, 97.3% launch reliability. Soviet SS-18, 78.2% launch reliability. Soviet SS-25, 71.8% launch reliability. Warhead reliability. American W-78/W-87, 99.2% estimated reliability. Soviet warheads, 73 to 82% estimated reliability. Command and control. American Mil-Star system, 99.97% uptime. Soviet command network, 67% reliability under optimal conditions. Submarine operations. American Ohio class, 95% patrol readiness. Soviet Typhoon class, 41% patrol readiness. These numbers explain everything. Maslin wrote in his classified report, the Americans could confidently expect their weapons to work. We could only hope ours would. This uncertainty fundamentally undermined deterrence credibility. The reliability gap stemmed from systematic differences in approach. American weapons received continuous maintenance, component replacement, and life extension upgrades. Soviet weapons were built, deployed, and often left to deteriorate until they became unusable. At Pantex, they showed us a warhead that had been in service for 20 years. Dr. Tretnev recalled. Every component had been inspected, tested, replaced as needed. It was statistically more reliable than the day it was manufactured. Our warheads degraded over time. Theirs improved. The safety chasm. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the gap in nuclear safety. The Americans had spent billions ensuring their weapons couldn't detonate accidentally. The Soviets had accepted accident risk as inevitable. During inspections, American officers explained the comprehensive safety systems in their weapons. Permissive action links, PAL electronic locks requiring coded authorization. Enhanced nuclear detonation safety. Multiple independent safety systems. Insensitive high explosives. Conventional explosives that wouldn't detonate in fires or crashes. Fire-resistant pits. Plutonium cores protected against fire. Environmental sensing devices. Weapons that couldn't arm unless specific conditions were met. One American warhead designer walked us through the W-88 safety systems. Colonel Popov recorded. 7 independent interlocks. Each one alone could prevent detonation. The warhead could survive aircraft crash, fire, crushing, explosion of nearby conventional weapons, and remain safe. We had nothing comparable. Soviet weapons, designed during the paranoid Stalin era, prioritized readiness over safety. Many lacked electronic locks. Commanders could arm weapons without Moscow authorization. Safety systems were minimal. The Americans told us about 32 broken arrow incidents, accidents involving nuclear weapons. Lebed wrote, in 32 incidents over 46 years, not a single weapon detonated. Some were in crashes, fires, or even lost at sea. None exploded. This safety record seemed miraculous until we understood their safety engineering. The Soviets, by contrast, had experienced at least 14 known accidents where weapons were damaged or lost, and the actual number was likely higher, hidden by Soviet secrecy. The near-miss incidents were terrifying. They told us about the 1961 Goldboro incident. Captain Kolesnikov wrote, a B-52 broke apart over North Carolina. 2 3.8 megaton bombs fell. One weapon went through all its arming steps except one. A single safety switch prevented a nuclear detonation on American soil. But the weapon didn't explode because American safety systems worked. If a Soviet weapon had gone through the same sequence, we would have lost a city. The economic reckoning. As the inspections progressed, the economic dimension became impossible to ignore. The Americans had achieved nuclear superiority while maintaining history's most prosperous society. The Soviets had bankrupted themselves, achieving nuclear parity that proved illusory. Captain Vitko, the submarine officer, spent considerable time discussing budgets with American counterparts. The conversation haunted him. An American submarine captain told me his annual operations budget. Vitko wrote, $38 million for one submarine for 1 year. This included maintenance, crew training, food, everything. His submarine was worth $2.4 billion. The United States maintained 18 Ohio-class boats, plus 55 attack submarines. The naval nuclear budget exceeded $40 billion annually. For comparison, the entire Soviet Navy received perhaps $30 billion. We operated more submarines, 75 ballistic missile subs, 200 attack boats. But ours were poorly maintained, unreliable, dangerous. The Americans had fewer submarines, but each one was a technological marvel that actually worked. The comparison extended across all military domains. The Americans spent more, but achieved dramatically more value. Their weapons worked reliably. Their personnel were well-trained and well-paid. Their infrastructure was maintained. Their technology advanced continuously. We thought we were matching American spending, reflected Colonel Zhukov. In rubles, perhaps we were close. But the ruble was worthless. Our defense industries were inefficient, corrupt, technologically backward. We spent as much as the Americans and got half as much capability. Then we spent twice as much trying to catch up and got even less return. It was economic suicide. The doctrine divide. Beyond hardware, the inspections revealed fundamental doctrinal differences that explained why the Americans had ultimately prevailed. At Strategic Command, Russian officers attended briefings on American nuclear doctrine. The explanations shattered Soviet assumptions about American strategy. The briefing officer explained that American nuclear doctrine was purely defensive. Lebed recalled, the United States had rejected first use since the 1960s. Nuclear weapons existed solely to deter nuclear attack. If deterrence failed, the weapons would retaliate, but victory was impossible. This concept, that nuclear war was unwinnable, represented the core of American thinking. The Soviet Union had never truly accepted this premise. Soviet doctrine held that nuclear war, while catastrophic, could be won through civil defense, first strike capability, and survivable forces. The Americans built their arsenal assuming mutual destruction, explained Colonel Balyevsky. We built ours assuming victory. Their assumption was correct. Ours was delusional. The doctrinal difference manifested in weapons design. American weapons emphasized accuracy, reliability, and second strike capability. Soviet weapons emphasized yield, numbers, and first strike potential. We designed SS-18s to destroy American missile silos, explained Colonel Petrov. Massive warheads, high accuracy, rapid launch capability. The Americans designed Minuteman III to survive first strike and retaliate. Different assumptions, different weapons. But American assumptions proved correct. The SS-18, for all its power, couldn't destroy submarines at sea. And submarines at sea guaranteed American retaliation. The Soviets had built weapons for a war they couldn't win. The Americans had built weapons for a war they'd make sure never happened. The human cost. Amid the statistics and technical revelations, some inspectors began calculating the human toll of the arms race. Dr. Trutnev, the weapons designer, visited the Trinity site in New Mexico where the first nuclear weapon was tested. Standing at ground zero, he contemplated what his career had wrought. I designed weapons that could kill millions, he wrote in his private diary. I was proud of this work. It was patriotic service. But standing where Oppenheimer stood, I understood his words. Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds. How many people could the weapons I designed kill? 10 million? 20 million? I created instruments of genocide and called it defense. The Americans had wrestled with these moral questions for decades. Many of the scientists the Russian team met had participated in anti-nuclear movements, even while working on weapons. The contradiction troubled Soviet officers raised in a system where questioning orders meant treason. An American physicist told me he protested nuclear weapons every weekend, recalled Dr. Trutnev. Monday through Friday, he designed them. Saturdays, he marched against them. I asked how he reconciled this. He said he couldn't, but living with contradiction was better than stopping thought. The inspection teams also learned about the American nuclear veterans, soldiers exposed to radiation during weapons tests. The government had tracked them, studied them, compensated them for illnesses. The Soviet Union had simply denied that radiation casualties existed. They showed us medical studies of soldiers exposed to radiation during Nevada tests in the 1950s, wrote Captain Kolesnikov. Detailed health records, compensation programs, ongoing medical care. We had sent soldiers into radioactive zones at Semipalatinsk with no protection and no follow-up. Many died. Their families received nothing. The environmental apocalypse. The inspections revealed environmental damage from nuclear weapons production that staggered both sides. The Americans, operating under environmental laws since the 1970s, had at least attempted remediation. The Soviets had simply poisoned vast territories. At the Hanford site in Washington state, inspectors toured the facility that had produced plutonium for American weapons since 1943. The site was contaminated, with groundwater pollution and soil contamination requiring billions in cleanup. Hanford was an environmental disaster, wrote Colonel Petrov. Decades of plutonium production had poisoned the Columbia River. The Americans were spending $2 billion annually on cleanup, more than our entire environmental budget. But Hanford looked pristine compared to Soviet facilities. At Mayak, near Chelyabinsk, plutonium production had created what some called the most contaminated place on Earth. Radioactive waste had been dumped directly into rivers. An explosion in 1957 had contaminated 15,000 square miles. Lake Karachay was so radioactive that standing on its shore for an hour would deliver a lethal dose. The Americans were cleaning up their mess. Lebed noted, "We had created messes so vast that cleanup was impossible. We had poisoned our own country in the name of national defense." The human toll was incalculable. Around Semipalatinsk, where the Soviet Union conducted 456 nuclear tests, cancer rates were 25 times the national average. Birth defects plagued generations. The government had known and done nothing. At Nevada test site, they monitored downwind populations. Dr. Trutnev observed, when tests produced excessive fallout, they compensated affected communities. We tested upwind of populated areas and pretended nothing happened. The intelligence failure. As inspections continued, another revelation emerged. Soviet intelligence had fundamentally misassessed American capabilities throughout the Cold War. The GRU and KGB had spent billions on espionage, recruited hundreds of spies, stolen thousands of documents. Yet they had consistently underestimated American nuclear forces, while overestimating American intentions. Our intelligence services reported what the leadership wanted to hear, explained Colonel Balyevsky, who had worked in military intelligence. When we reported American strengths, we were accused of defeatism. When we reported American weaknesses, we were promoted. The result was systematic intelligence failure. Soviet assessments underestimated American ICBM numbers by 20%, bomber capabilities by 30%, submarine quietness by orders of magnitude. Meanwhile, they overestimated American willingness to launch first strikes, creating paranoia that drove wasteful Soviet weapons programs. The Americans knew more about our forces than we knew about theirs, admitted Lebed. Their satellites photographed our missile fields. Their submarines tracked ours. Their signals intelligence intercepted our communications. Meanwhile, our intelligence was giving Politburo fantasy assessments that bore no relation to reality. The most damaging intelligence failure was the misunderstanding of American intentions. Soviet intelligence consistently reported that the United States was preparing for nuclear first strike, when in fact American doctrine had rejected first use decades earlier. We built weapons to counter an American first strike that was never coming, reflected Colonel Petrov. We bankrupted our economy defending against a threat that existed only in our paranoid imaginations. The technology transfer. Despite Cold War tensions, American scientists had maintained contact with Soviet counterparts through international conferences and academic exchanges. These contacts had provided the Soviets with more useful technology transfer than espionage ever achieved. At Los Alamos, a physicist mentioned that he had met Soviet scientists at conferences in Europe. Dr. Trutnev recalled, they had discussed theoretical physics, material science, even some weapons concepts. The Americans shared openly what we tried to steal covertly. The irony was profound. Soviet spies had risked their lives stealing American nuclear secrets, information that American scientists would have shared freely if asked directly. The Americans believed science belonged to humanity. Trutnev wrote, we believed it belonged to the state. Their openness advanced human knowledge. Our secrecy retarded it. Soviet weapons designers had benefited enormously from American academic publications. Concepts developed at American universities, published in open scientific journals, were incorporated into Soviet weapons. The Americans essentially provided free research and development. Half our weapons designs incorporated American ideas, admitted Colonel Popov, not from espionage, but from reading their physics journals. They published everything except the most critical details. We published nothing and fell behind anyway. The waste of competition. By summer 1992, the Russian inspection teams had witnessed enough to understand the true nature of the arms race, a competition that had enriched neither side and nearly bankrupted one. The United States had spent $5.5 trillion on nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had spent $4.5 trillion. Combined, the superpowers had devoted $10 trillion to weapons designed never to be used. The opportunity cost was staggering. $10 trillion, calculated Captain Vitko. The Americans could have rebuilt every city in their country twice. We could have fed our people, housed them properly, modernized our entire economy. Instead, we built 120,000 nuclear weapons between us, enough to destroy human civilization 40 times over. The waste extended beyond money. Millions of lives had been devoted to nuclear weapons production. Brilliant scientists had spent careers designing ever more efficient ways to kill millions. Entire cities, closed nuclear cities in the Soviet Union, had existed solely to produce weapons. At Artemis 16, 100,000 people devoted their lives to nuclear weapons. Dr. Trutnev reflected. What could they have accomplished if that brilliance had been directed toward peaceful purposes? Medicine, agriculture, space exploration. We wasted human genius on instruments of death. The environmental damage would require centuries to remediate. The psychological trauma of living under nuclear threat had affected generations. The political tensions had distorted international relations and fueled proxy wars across the globe. All this for weapons that could never be used. Lebed wrote, "We spent 46 years preparing for a war that would end human civilization. It was collective insanity." The final accounting. By December 1992, the initial round of START inspections concluded. The Russian teams returned home with transformative knowledge and profound disillusionment. Colonel Petrov submitted his final report to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Unlike previous intelligence assessments, this one was brutally honest. The Cold War was not a competition between equals. The Soviet Union never achieved strategic parity with the United States. We achieved the illusion of parity through quantitative measures that masked qualitative inferiority. American nuclear forces exceeded Soviet capabilities in every meaningful category: accuracy, reliability, safety, command and control, supporting infrastructure, technological sophistication, and operational readiness. More significantly, the United States achieved this superiority while maintaining economic prosperity, political freedom, and improving living standards. The Soviet Union bankrupted itself pursuing an impossible goal. The arms race was not driven by American aggression or nuclear superiority. It was driven by Soviet paranoia and systemic inefficiency. We built weapons to counter threats that existed primarily in our imagination. The revelation of American nuclear capabilities during START inspections demonstrates that the United States exercised remarkable restraint during the Cold War. At any point, America could have expanded its arsenal beyond any possibility of Soviet response. They chose not to, not from weakness, but from judgment that existing forces ensured deterrence. We did not lose the Cold War on the battlefield. We lost it in the factory, the laboratory, and the economic planning office. We lost it when we chose to devote 20% of our economy to military purposes, while America devoted 6% and achieved superior results. Most critically, we lost the Cold War morally. We built nuclear weapons to dominate others. Americans built them to prevent war. We created instruments of conquest. They created instruments of deterrence. History proved them correct. The report circulated among Russian military leadership and contributed to fundamental restructuring of Russian strategic forces. Numbers would be reduced. Quality would be emphasized. The quest for quantitative parity would be abandoned. The human transformation. The Soviet officers who participated in the START inspections returned to Russia as changed men. What they had witnessed couldn't be unknown, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be explained away. Many wrote memoirs or gave interviews, describing their experiences. The themes were remarkably consistent. On American power. We understood American military power intellectually, reflected Colonel Balyevsky. We saw their satellites, tracked their submarines, counted their missiles. But we didn't comprehend the system that produced this power. The industrial base, the research infrastructure, the educational system, the economic engine. These created American military might. We tried to match their output without building the system that produced it. We failed because we had to fail. On Soviet illusions, we believed our own propaganda, admitted Lebed. We told ourselves that socialist economy was more efficient, that central planning was superior, that capitalist contradictions would destroy America. The inspections shattered these delusions. America wasn't collapsing. It was thriving. And we were the ones approaching economic collapse. On wasted lives. I devoted 25 years to military service, wrote Colonel Petrov. I believed I was defending my country against existential threat. The inspections revealed that the threat was largely imaginary. America wasn't preparing to invade the Soviet Union. They didn't want to conquer us. They just wanted us to leave them alone. We wasted generations on needless competition, on moral reckoning. We called ourselves defenders of peace while preparing for nuclear war, reflected Dr. Trutnev. The Americans called themselves nuclear warriors while building weapons to prevent war. The terminology mattered less than the truth. They understood that nuclear weapons had made traditional warfare obsolete. We never fully accepted this reality. The legacy of truth. The START inspections continued beyond 1992, expanding into the New START Treaty and subsequent agreements. The transparency regime established by these inspections fundamentally changed the U.S.-Russian relationship. Russian officers who had witnessed American nuclear facilities became advocates for arms control and military reform. They understood that security came not from matching American capabilities, an impossible goal, but from stable deterrence at reduced levels. Several inspection veterans rose to senior Russian military and political positions. General Yuri Balyuevsky became chief of the General Staff, 2004 to 2008, and implemented reforms emphasizing quality over quantity. He reduced Russian strategic forces while modernizing what remained. His motto became, "We cannot match American numbers. We must match American professionalism." General Alexander Lebed served as Secretary of the Security Council and presidential candidate. He publicly advocated arms reduction and military reform based on his inspection experiences. His memoirs revealed Soviet military weaknesses and American strengths with unprecedented honesty. Dr. Yevgeny Maslin headed Russia's nuclear weapons program, 1992 to 1997, and oversaw dramatic reforms in safety, security, and accounting. He implemented American-style permissive action links on Russian weapons and improved storage security with American technical assistance. Admiral Igor Kolesnikov, he was promoted, served as first deputy commander of the Russian Navy and modernized submarine operations. He emphasized reliability over numbers, quality over quantity. Under his leadership, Russian submarine operational tempo decreased, but safety and effectiveness improved dramatically. These officers, and dozens of others, brought home lessons from American nuclear facilities that shaped Russian military policy for decades. They had seen the future and it worked. More importantly, they had seen the present and understood why the Soviet system hadn't. The broader lesson. The story of Soviet officers stunned by American nuclear capabilities parallels the German POWs stunned by American industrial might 5 decades earlier. Both experiences demonstrated the same profound truth. Free societies with market economies and rule of law generate material abundance and technological superiority that authoritarian systems cannot match. The German POWs had witnessed American factories producing bombers every hour. The Soviet inspectors witnessed American laboratories designing warheads with computer precision. Different technologies, identical lesson. Freedom produces prosperity, and prosperity produces power. Both groups returned home as transformed individuals. The German POWs became architects of democratic West Germany. The Soviet inspectors became architects of reformed Russian military. Both had seen what was possible when societies organized around freedom rather than coercion. The psychological mechanism was identical, the complete demolition of ideology through direct observation. No propaganda campaign could have achieved what simple reality accomplished. The Americans didn't need to convince anyone of anything. They simply opened their facilities and let observers reach their own conclusions. The final irony, perhaps the greatest irony of the START inspections, was that American nuclear superiority, once revealed, proved less threatening than Soviet paranoia had imagined. The Soviet Union had bankrupted itself, building weapons to counter an American nuclear arsenal that was even more powerful than feared. But American intentions were far less threatening than imagined. The United States had built overwhelming nuclear superiority and then chose not to exploit it. This restraint, incomprehensible to Soviet thinking, demonstrated strength that surpassed military capability. The Americans could have destroyed us at any point, reflected Lebed in his final interview before his death in 2002. Not just militarily, they could have done that easily, but economically, politically, psychologically. They had the power to crush the Soviet Union, and they chose not to. This restraint revealed strength we never understood. They were secure enough in their power that they didn't need to prove it constantly. This was the ultimate lesson of the inspections. True power doesn't require demonstration. The Americans had built the world's most formidable nuclear arsenal and then worked diligently to ensure it would never be used. They had achieved absolute security and used it to pursue peace rather than domination. We built weapons to conquer, Dr. Trutnev wrote in his 2010 memoir. They built weapons to deter. We saw weapons as instruments of national will. They saw them as necessary evils. History proved them wise and us fools. Conclusion: the arsenal of democracy triumphant. On December 5, 2009, Presidents Obama and Medvedev signed the new START Treaty in Prague, further reducing deployed strategic warheads to 1,550 per side. Among those present were several veterans of the original 1991 to 1992 inspections, now senior officials in their respective governments. Admiral Kolesnikov, attending as an observer, found himself standing next to an American counterpart he had first met during inspections at Kings Bay in 1992. They had maintained correspondence for 17 years. "We were enemies once," Kolesnikov said. "No," the American replied. "We were opponents. We were never enemies." The distinction captured the essence of what the inspections had revealed. The Cold War had been a competition between systems, not a war between peoples. One system, democratic, free market, open, had proven superior in every meaningful measure, not through military conquest, but through superior organization, technology, and ultimately wisdom. The Soviet officers who witnessed American nuclear capabilities during the START inspections had expected to find an aggressive enemy preparing for nuclear domination. Instead, they found a secure nation that had built overwhelming power and chosen to use it for deterrence rather than coercion. They had come seeking intelligence about American weapons. They left with wisdom about American character. They had arrived as Soviet officers defending a failed ideology. They departed as students of a better system. They had entered American nuclear facilities as enemies. They left as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The German POWs of World War II had discovered the arsenal of democracy producing tanks and planes in impossible quantities. The Soviet inspectors of the 1990s discovered the same arsenal had produced nuclear capabilities beyond comprehension, and then exercised the wisdom not to use them. In both cases, America's secret weapon wasn't superior technology or industrial capacity, though both were impressive. The secret weapon was the freedom that produced prosperity, the prosperity that enabled capability, and the security that encouraged restraint. The Soviet officers had been stunned by America's nuclear arsenal, but ultimately, they were transformed by America's wisdom in building weapons powerful enough to end civilization, and then working tirelessly to ensure they never would be used. That was the true strength of the arsenal of democracy, the power to destroy combined with the judgment not to. The inspectors returned to Russia, carrying this knowledge, and in carrying it, they brought seeds of transformation that would help build a new relationship between former enemies. They had witnessed the nuclear arsenal that won the Cold War without firing a shot, and in witnessing it, they understood why it never had to.